Czechoslovakia. What is a Czechoslovakia? Is this a Czechoslovakia? How about this? Am I a Czechoslovakia? What about Dave? I have a great idea. Let's split up an empire so we can make a Czechoslovakia. All this and more in this episode of In the Beer. Quick disclaimer, a lot of the info in this video is taken from this video right here. I'll have a link in the description, but be aware that the video is not in English, and if you want to find the video about this tank in English, then good luck, because there aren't any. You're stuck with me, bitch. In order to pad out the running time of this video, let's talk about Czechoslovakia. So if you want to skip this part, then move to this timestamp in the corner. When World War I finally came to an end, the Austro-Hungarian Empire was split into a bunch of countries your average American mistakes for Germany, those being Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and some other parts that went on to become Yugoslavia or parts of Poland. Unlike Austria and Hungary, Czechoslovakia was part of the victors of World War I, as many Czechoslovak legionnaires abandoned their posts and deserted towards the French, or more famously, the Russians. As Tsarist Russia was going through an uneventful revolution, most legionnaires that deserted towards the Russian lines weren't allowed to go back home via the western border when the war ended. So instead, they took control of the Trans-Siberian Railway and circumnavigated the globe to get to the newly formed Czechoslovakia, which consisted of modern-day Czech Republic, Slovakia, and Carpathian Ruthenia. I know I'm aggressively oversimplifying it, but it's a fascinating story which you can now find on Curiosity. Czechoslovakia was in a pretty good position when it gained independence, as when it was under Austro-Hungarian rule, most of the empire's heavy industry was located in Bohemia and Moravia, which turned Czechoslovakia into a heavily industrialized country. This allowed Czechoslovakia to do what most countries its size couldn't, that being designing and producing tanks domestically. Czechoslovakia, like most countries, experimented with the FT-17, and Czechoslovakia's first domestic design was the Houska, basically a Czechoslovakian Bob Semple. Fast forward a bit, and now we get the LTVZ-35. The LTVZ-35 was what the Panzer III was to the Germans, i.e., this was the primary tank they were going to use if a war broke out. A lot of people, including Czechs, like to believe the LTVZ-38 was Czechoslovakia's pride and joy. However, this is not the case. When the LTVZ-38 was advertised to the Czechoslovakian military, the response was pretty muted. Czechoslovakia already had the tank they wanted. They didn't need a new tank that was practically the same as the one they've already been mass producing. The only place where the LTVZ-38 saw widespread commercial success was in other countries like Syria, Bulgaria, Hungary, Iran, Switzerland, Peru, and more notably, Sweden. On September 30th, 1938, the Munich Agreement was signed. This is seen as a huge betrayal, as due to the signing of the agreement, Czechoslovakia basically had to give the Germans all their heavy fortifications. The Munich Agreement is a shit show when it comes to the morality of the situation. On one hand, Czechoslovakian officials weren't allowed into the room where the agreement was signed, thus creating the slogan, "About us, without us." But on the other hand, the British and the French didn't want to go into another war that would cost millions of lives, as most British and French officials were all veterans of the Great War. This is where the power of hindsight can be a bitch, as most people only see the outcome of the situation rather than the reasoning. Most politicians were in the Great War fighting as infantry or officers, often having to send young lives to their deaths in suicide death runs across no man's land. To these politicians, keeping the peace was of the utmost importance, and if that meant giving a little bit of land to Germany from a country that no one's ever heard of, then so be it. Besides, at the time, Hitler's expansion was seen as somewhat reasonable to the general populace, with Churchill being one of the exceptions. To most people, Germany was only uniting the Germanic states, which sounded innocent enough. You can see this during the annexation of Austria, with over 99% of Austrians voting in support of the annexation. However, the Sudetenland is a different cookie. Unlike Austria, the Sudetenland is not made up of one ethnicity. Yes, the majority were ethnic Germans, but there were still large portions of Czechs. But this wasn't Hitler's goal. His primary objective was the huge fortifications along the Czechoslovak border. Luckily for Hitler, these fortifications were positioned in the Sudetenland, as mentioned, a region with a very large percentage of ethnic Germans. So Hitler struck a deal with Chamberlain and that one French guy no one remembers, that forced Czechoslovakia to give up the Sudetenland to the Germans, thus making them completely defenseless against a German invasion. On March 14, 1939, Slovakia makes a deal with Nazi Germany which allowed them to gain independence for the first time in history. A day later, on March 15th, Germany invades Czechoslovakia, or what's left of it, thus creating the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia. Now you might be saying, what the fuck does this have to do with the PM-1? And I'd say good point. When Germany annexed Czechia, they did what Germany does best, that being searching for tanks they could fuck with, just like they do with any other tank. However, the tank that caught their eye was the LTVZ-38, which was then shoved into German service, known as the Panzer 38T. A couple of variants later, and Germany forces, I'm not even going to try to pronounce that, to design a new casemate tank destroyer, known as the Jagdpanzer 38. Since I've mentioned the 38T, you might be knowing where I'm trying to go with this. But no, the Jagdpanzer 38 was not made on the 38T. You all probably know this, unless you think Boviton is a reliable source. The incorrect designation on the Fury tank strikes a particular chord with me, as it's one I used to subscribe to. Anyway, back to the Houska. The Jagdpanzer 38 was an okay tank destroyer. I know, you're probably furiously screaming at me because of that.
How dare you say that about the Hetzer? It's the greatest thing I've ever been built. Hetzer gonna Hetz.
But the thing is, unlike the Stug, the Hetzer is not the most ergonomic tank, mostly due to its angling sides. The T-34 has a similar problem. The Jagdpanzer 38 was primarily made because the factory that made Stugs was bombed, and other factories either couldn't make them because they were already making other tanks, or the Stug was too heavy for the factory to handle. So whatever this company is, designed and later produced the Jagdpanzer 38. The Hetzer had many major problems. Besides the aforementioned ergonomics, there was a chance that the final drive could break when traversing the hull. The positioning of the gun meant that the suspension had uneven wear. The lack of viewports meant situational awareness was subpar at best. The driver, gunner, and loader all had to share the same hatch. The loader was on the opposite side of the gun, which means the loaders had to be specifically trained, otherwise loading the gun could prove to be dangerous. Not to mention, a lot of factory workers intentionally sabotaged production. However, the Jagdpanzer 38 did have its upsides. It was faster than most German tank destroyers. Its frontal armor was pretty good. That 75mm could reliably take out most threats it came across. And the vehicle was easy and cheap enough to produce that it didn't put too much strain on the German war effort, unlike some other tanks. The Hetzer is like the Tiger and T-34-85. Definitely overhyped, but it's not really bad. It's more of a, it's good I guess, kind of vehicle. Also, small sidetrack, many people believe that if Germany built more Hetzers, they would have won the war. I think you can see the flaw in this logic. But unless you can't, here's a small explanation. This argument is the exact same as the just make more Panzer IVs, and they both have the same problem. Germany's problem wasn't that the tanks they were making were expensive, rather, the problem was manpower, logistics, and fuel. And, I hate to say this, but making more Panthers was the right decision. I know, heresy, hiss, boo. But Germany was in a pretty cucked position when it came to 1944, and out of the series of bad ideas, the one they decided to go with was simply put, the least bad one. To Germany, making less better tanks was more beneficial than making more lesser tanks. Anyway, now that we have that out of the way, we can finally start talking about the PM-1. So what is the PM-1? From the looks of it, it may seem like a Jagdpanzer 38 that had its main gun removed and instead had a turret from an LTVZ-38 mounted on top, and you'd be partially correct. The PM-1 was Czechoslovakia's first and only attempt at making a flamethrower tank. Throughout World War II, many nations, including the Big Four, mounted flamethrowers into tanks in order to bolster their anti-infantry and anti-bunker capabilities. most famous of which are the R3 series of Shermans, Churchill Crocodile, and if you ever played World at War, OT-34. So when it came to Czechoslovakia, they also wanted to get in on that hot action. In 1946, the Ministry of Defense proposed a tank that had a primary main cannon and a secondary flamethrower, also known as the TVP project. This was originally supposed to be a joint design between Czechoslovakia and the Soviet Union. Czechoslovakia originally wanted to produce licensed M4 Shermans, once again cementing the fact that the Sherman was the best tank ever created. But Czechoslovakian factories didn't have the necessary machinery to produce them and were hoping that the TVP program would allow something similar, if not more. However, due to reasons unknown to my knowledge, the TVP program was cancelled. But Czechoslovakia still wanted a flamethrower tank, so they picked the ST-1, the Hetzer, as the base chassis. In 1948, the Škoda factory in Plzeň repaired a bunch of said ST-1s, which were given to ČKD in order to be refitted. This wouldn't be the first time a flamethrower was shoved into the Jagdpanzer 38, as the Germans did it way back during World War II with the Flammpanzer 38T. Another side note, I genuinely don't know why the Jagdpanzer 38 didn't get the T designation while the Flammpanzer does, so if any of you know, let me know because that's something I'm interested in for some reason, but I digress. When picking out which flamethrower they were going to use, they originally wanted to use one from Sigma Pump. However, while being tested, it was found that the German World War II Flammenwerfer 41 was a more practical choice, as 1, it was simpler design, and 2, Czechoslovakian arms manufacturers already had experience with manufacturing the German design. And after many drafts, ČKD finally achieved the impossible. This is where we get to the first prototype of the PM-1, also known as Nautilus. Nautilus had its hull slightly altered. You see this bulge on the right side of the hull? That was an attempt to mount fuel and pumps internally. However, you can probably see the problem with this, as if the tank was ever hit in the side, the tank would... Nautilus's turret was stripped from an old Czechoslovak armored car. I tried looking for an armored car which used the same turret, but the closest I've gotten was the OA VZ-30. In this turret, the flamethrower was housed, and in the coax was supposed to be a VZ-37 heavy machine gun. Where the 75mm cannon used to be, is now a plate of armor stripped from a Jagdpanzer IV. This is prevalent on all three prototypes. The second and third prototypes were supposed to mitigate these problems, as previously said. These had two main differences from the first. The first being the turret, this time using one from an LT-VZ-38, and the second being the flammable liquid and pumps being stored externally in this box. These prototypes also sported a new flamethrower, this one manufactured by Konstrukta Praha, a company which today focuses on modernizing military equipment in Slovakia. The flamethrower had an impressive range of 120 meters. Konstrukta was also meant to create a new mix for the flammable liquid, which was supposed to be lighter and in theory be able to have an effective range of 185 meters. However, due to the mix not properly sticking to its intended target, it was abandoned. The turret also sported a Soviet DT machine gun mounted in the coax. The tank completed its trials and in many ways exceeded in its qualifications. However, by 1955, the tanks were already deemed obsolete and the project was canned, with all but one of the prototypes being scrapped, with the last one remaining until 1957 for testing new flamethrowers. However, this one also found itself on the receiving end of a scrapper. For the next decade, Czechoslovakia failed to make any prototypes of its own, and in 1968, when the Warsaw Pact invaded Czechoslovakia for not being communist enough, Czechoslovakia wasn't allowed to continue their tank program. So this makes the PM-1 the last Czechoslovakian tank.
Donkey Kong is here!